Hello, everyone. Welcome to what should be a very fun and very special reading vlog, which I'm doing to commemorate being on BookTube for 10 years. The plan as of now is for this video to go up on November 22nd, 2023, if all goes according to plan, if everything goes well. So fingers crossed. That's wild. That's a lot to process. I'm very grateful. I'm very honored. It's been great to have the longevity that I've been able to have. And I just feel grateful to be able to be continuing to make content that I feel good about and I believe in. So obviously I wanted to do something special because 10 years is such a milestone. I didn't want to just let it pass without commemorating it in some way. So I thought I would do something of a reading experiment. I don't often do videos like this, and I know for some people it's like their bread and butter, and I completely respect that. But for me personally, my time and energy especially is so limited that I really just try to use it to focus in on things I know I'm going to feel really strongly about. And sometimes with videos like these, you might end up spending your time on things that you don't like. But to combat that and also tie this into the fact that this is a celebration of me being on BookTube for 10 years, I thought I would reread some books that I read when I first started out in 2013. I'm not going to be too ambitious. I'm going to give myself a little bit of wiggle room because I did start pretty late in the year. So to be accurate, I would have to look at like late 2013, early 2014, something in that space. Now, I already know which books I would like to try to read for this experiment, but I thought it would be fun to give you a little overview of what I was reading in 2013. So I have my reading challenge history pulled up on Goodreads. Hopefully you can see it. And I'm going to go all the way back to 2013. Starting off strong with rereading some of the Princess Diaries books for some reason. Also, Dystopia was huge in 2013, so I see a lot of that here, Crossed by Ali Kandi, the Divergent trilogy by Veronica Roth, a reread of The Hunger Games, A Dance with Dragons I read in 2013. I feel like a lot of people don't know that I've read all the books in the Song of Ice and Fire series, but I have, in fact, done that for some reason. Again, we have the Maze Runner trilogy, Paper Towns by John Green, the first 3 books in the City of Bones trilogy by Cassandra Clare, and also all of the books in the Infernal Devices trilogy. That's wild. The Night Circus, Ready Player One, The Knife of Never Letting Go. These were like BookTube darlings back in 2013. But here at the top, and remember that Goodreads orders these in reverse chronological order, so the most recent book or the last book you read at the end of the year is at the top, and the first book you read is at the bottom. So here, towards the end of the year, you can see I read Vicious by V.E. Schwab. I want to be very careful here because I know that V.E. Schwab is a very dearly beloved author. A lot of people love their books. A lot of people connect with the series and the characters that they've written, and I respect that. But their work in the long run has turned out to be not really for me. I genuinely wanted to be on the V.E. Schwab train for quite some time. As you can see, Vicious actually came out in 2013. I read it right when it released. I had a first edition hardcover that I no longer have. And at the time, I was beating that drum for a while. I was like, this is the best book in existence. As you can see from this reading challenge, I actually enjoyed Vicious so much, I went back and read the novella Warm Up, which I think is a prequel novella. I've also read the first 2 books in the Darker Shades of Magic trilogy, and I didn't feel invested enough personally to even continue on and finish with the 3rd book. And also I've read the first book in the Monsters of Verity duology, I want to say, the one that begins with Our Dark Duet, which I have to admit I really did not like. So it's really hard to describe because I started off with Vicious in 2013, and like I said, that was top tier for me at the time when I first read it. I think I gave it 5 stars. I'm pretty sure I gave it 5 stars. And then the more of her books I kept reading, the bigger that disconnect kept growing, the lower I found myself rating her books over time. And I was just like, you know, this is just a case of it's both you and me. We just don't work. So follow my logic here. I just thought it would be interesting to go back and see how I feel about Vicious now, because there was such a big difference between how I was rating V.E. Schwab's books before I gave up on them and when I first started with Vicious, which, like I said, was a huge 5 stars for me at the time. So how do I feel about it now, especially with that complicated history? So I found a used copy of Vicious by V.E. Schwab in this new redesigned edition, and I'm gonna reread it, and it's probably gonna be a mess, and I'm just gonna see how I feel. So that's going to be my main focus for this project. If I only finish one book in this entire thing, I would like it to be this book. But I do have a stretch goal of sorts. So let's see what I was reading in early 2014. It truly is so wild to go back and look at these because there's so many books on here that I would never in a million years even remotely touch if you ask me to today. So this is quite the experience. We have the Just One Day duology by Gail Forman, lots of manga. This was my Attack on Titan era. Again, I've given that up since. The Coldest Girl in Cold Town is an extremely underrated YA vampire book that I enjoy very much and have reread several times, and I think it holds up, but that's not what I chose for this video. There's truly so much here. I read Song of Achilles for the first time. I read the Ouran High School Host Club series in its entirety. I read the entirety of Full Metal Alchemist. Like, a lot was happening in 2014. But I want to draw your attention to the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy by Laini Taylor. I know Laini Taylor hasn't written too much and hasn't put out much lately, but I've read both of her bigger series. I read the entirety of the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy and also the Strange the Dreamer duology as well, and I have loved both of those so much. Daughter of Smoke and Bone actually holds a really special place in my heart in terms of my reading history, though, because this was the book that got me back into using my library a lot more than I did before this point. For some reason, between childhood and adulthood, I somehow lost my library card, so I wasn't able to go for a few years. And me discovering Daughter of Smoke and Bone happened organically on the day I decided to go to my library when I was in college and to just get a new card. Not for this video, but just for myself, I did actually recently get new editions of Daughter of Smoke and Bone. These are the UK paperback editions, and they are glorious. So if I have the time, if I have the bandwidth, I would really love to also revisit this. So I'm going to start rereading Vicious today. I actually don't remember much about it. From the very little I remember, I believe it's about these two feuding college roommates who used to be best friends working on this huge thesis project together, and they discover how to give humans superpowers. But that scientific breakthrough actually tore them apart, and now the story is taking place 10 years afterwards when they're actually enemies and basically trying to take each other down. I think that's what it is. Don't quote me. We'll see how this goes. Just for the record, I'm pretty sure this vlog is just going to be purely reading updates, so I will see you in my next update. Hello, it's the next afternoon, and I'm currently this far into Vicious. It's 364 pages, I believe, and I'm about 150 pages in, so almost at the halfway mark. Before I get into my thoughts, I think I forgot to outline my predictions for this project in yesterday's introduction, which would have been very helpful, so I'm just going to do that now. Like I said yesterday, I gave Vicious 5 stars back when I read it for the first time in 2013. I do not think it's going to hold up to that. It's not going to be 5 stars in 2023. That's my prediction. And I think, or rather I hope, that Daughter of Smoke and Bone stays about the same in my estimation and that I still really enjoy it. Quick recap of the basic premise. I was pretty much correct. It is about these two former college roommates, Eli and Victor, who are sort of friends, sort of frenemies. They're more academic rivals in a sense. They're amicable. They spend a lot of time together, but each of them always wants to outdo the other person. So the story is told in parallel storylines, and we're alternating back and forth between flashbacks and flash forwards, and part of the story is set back in their college days when they're both working on their respective thesis projects. Victor is studying the effects of adrenaline on the human body, and Eli is trying to figure out whether there's a scientific basis for superpowered humans, which in this world they call extraordinaries or EOs. By the way, I have to briefly interject here because the fact that they call superpowered humans EOs is just silly. It's just ridiculous because the story is kind of set in our world, but not in our world. And there is a cultural understanding of superheroes because they reference Superman and Spider-Man. So superheroes and the term superhero just exists. So the fact that they try to make it feel less campy by calling them EOs and not superheroes is kind of ridiculous. Anyways, that's what's happening in the past, and the other main timeline takes place 10 years afterwards when Eli and Victor have somehow successfully combined their research to discover how to biologically create EOs and have done that to themselves, but their friendship has dramatically splintered in the process. In that timeline, Victor has just broken out of prison and now he is desperately trying to hunt down Eli to exact some kind of revenge. I mean, I knew going into this that my feelings about Vicious were going to be very complicated, and alas, my feelings are extremely complicated. The good thing is that it has these very short chapters. It's really aggressively paced. It's very action forward. So it's easy to get into. It's easy to feel engaged throughout the entire thing. And also because of the circumstances and the characters, as you might guess, it's also really strong on the dramatics. It's hard because in terms of what's happening on the surface, I am intrigued. I'm interested. I do feel compelled to continue reading. If I didn't, I would just stop. But that hasn't happened so far. But at the same time, to quote fucking Paul from the Great British Bake Off, it is erring on the side of all style, no substance. There are interesting things happening. There's some really cool concepts that are coming into play. But at the same time, in terms of the thematic work and the characterization, it just feels shallow. I think what could have been this story's greatest strength and what could have set it apart from other stories about superheroes and superpowered individuals is the fact that it's very scientifically based. The main characters are scientists and they're looking for a biological explanation as to how EOs can be created. But the problem is everything happens so quickly in this story that there's no room for these ideas and these character moments to really breathe. Even that interesting nugget of an idea doesn't feel satisfying because it just happens so fast. I think the best way to say it is that nothing that happens to the characters feels earned in any way, shape, or form. Everything that happens in the story is the result of two of my least favorite plot devices: convenience and coincidence. And going back to that concept of discovering or researching how superpowered individuals can be made in a world where superpowers don't seem to be a really big thing, that's a really fascinating concept. That's a great hook. But it doesn't feel satisfying because the story doesn't really explore that. The story doesn't really sit in that space. There's no back and forth between Eli and Victor as they gradually discover that their two respective thesis projects kind of beautifully marry together. There's no research. There's no experimentation. There's no trial and error. There's some trial and error, but like not to the extent that there should be in something like this. That's why nothing in the story feels earned, because the characters just have these random ideas or realizations in regards to how EOs might be created. And it's not based in research. It's not something that they've discovered. It's just something that came into their mind. And they don't even think to try to back it up with research afterwards, or, hey, let's try this out and test this out over several weeks. But like, hey, we're geniuses. That's the most brilliant, most obvious thing I've ever heard. Let's just jump the gun and do the final experiment tonight. This might be a bit of a spoiler, so feel free to skip ahead if you want to, but also this book's been out for over a decade, so who really cares? But like what they discover about how to create EOs is that they basically need to like kill themselves without dying completely and just come back from the absolute brink of death. And that's how they get superpowers. To try and create these circumstances where your body scientifically and biologically dies, but then comes back to life is a huge risk. So that's what makes it even more ridiculous when they're like, hey, I think we could become EOs if we die, but don't die. Sweet, dude, let's try it out tonight. And that kind of grates my nerves because I feel like that attitude is being positioned as hunger and ambition and arrogance. And it's just like, no, you're just stupid. And I remember when this first came out, it was just lauded and celebrated for being this incredibly complex story with morally gray characters. That was the selling point, morally gray characters. But the more I'm revisiting it and engaging with it more critically, I'm like, are you morally gray? Or are you just a white man who doesn't know what to do with his privilege and also a bitch baby with daddy issues who just has neither foot planted in reality. Personally, I think it's the latter. And I think the reason why I feel that way is because there are these really big moments. There are these pivotal moments that should dramatically affect the characters and impact their dynamic with each other. And just neither of them feel connected to what's happening. Also, I kind of just touched on it, but one of the reasons why this story is kind of getting on my nerves so far is that there's just completely unchecked white male privilege just running rampant in the story. And one of the examples of that is Victor's just recently broken out of prison. And when he's thinking back on his time in prison, he's like, that was a chill hang. That was pretty good for me because it gave me a lot of time to plan and think. I read stuff like that and I'm like, okay, dude, I'm so glad your time in our carceral system was a productive experience. I'm kind of jumping back and forth. My thoughts are all over the place. But also, another thing that really annoyed me, and this might be a mild spoiler, but not really because it happens really early in the story. There's a character who is a shared love interest between Eli and Victor, because of course she is. And her only purpose in the story is to get fridged, which is super messed up because it's not even in the interest of advancing the male character development because neither one of them feel anything when she dies. And the fact that they feel nothing is very purposeful. I feel like it's supposed to reveal to us that they're both awful people in their own way. But in the end, it just doesn't feel like anything. It just feels pointless. So those are my rambly, disjointed, most likely dramatically incomplete thoughts on Vicious so far. It's been quite a time, quite an experience. I also don't remember a lot of the story, so it almost does feel like reading it for the first time. So I'm interested to see how this continues. And I do have quite a bit of free time right now. So theoretically, if I really, really tried, I might be able to finish this. I would love to finish this in 2 days because that makes the possibility of getting through Daughter of Smoke and Bone that much more feasible. And I would love to finish this vlog on a high note as opposed to whatever this is. So it's currently Sunday afternoon. It is the next day, and I did, in fact, finish Vicious. TLDR, my prediction was pretty much completely correct. This does not hold up. I'm glad that my 2013 self enjoyed this book, but 2023 me, not so much. When I think about why this story doesn't work for me now, it always keeps coming back to the fact that it's hollow, it's empty, there's no emotional stakes. The entire crux of the story is the relationship between Victor and Eli. We're supposed to feel drawn into the story because of their obsession with each other, because of their absolute fixation on the other person, because they're just determined to track down this person who they once cared about, but now wronged them, and now they want revenge. But the problem with that is that we're not really given a friendship, a connection, a foundation, a dynamic even to mourn in the first place. We're just not given much to go off of even to begin with. Even where we start from in the flashbacks, they already have this solidified relationship as roommates. We know that they hang out outside of class. We know that they're academically motivated. We know they're obsessed with science. We know that they're both weirdly and strangely and grossly in love with the same girl, even though in love is a very strong phrase to use there. And that's pretty much it. We just never get to see them really feel anything for the other person at any point, even in the before, even before everything goes to hell, even before they get their superpowers, even before their friendship reaches the breaking point. And after the breaking point, there's even less emotional attachment and connection these two characters have to each other. And what's sad is that it's very purposefully done. It's done to show how awful they are as humans, to show how removed from their own humanity they've become, to put them on a different moral plane compared to most people or normal people. But that's the rub, because how are we supposed to buy into the fact that these two characters are just obsessed with exacting revenge on each other? They're singularly fixated on this huge showdown and how they want to hurt this person that they believe has wronged them in some deep and irrevocable way. How can we believe that if there's no emotional landscape, no emotional history, no emotional stakes? It's like the world's worst riddle that I just can't figure out. We also have to talk about Eli because that man is deeply, deeply troubling. And again, that's the rub because I know it's being done on purpose. I know we're supposed to be like shocked and disturbed by how awful these characters are and how removed from reality they are and the horrible things they're resorting to in order to get what they want. I get that that's the point. But the morals that Eli lives by, the morals that guide his life, are like textbook tenets of white supremacy. He's like this ultra Christian religious extremist. He views himself as the right hand of God. He actively and purposefully uses language and takes actions that dehumanize other EOs so that he can justify executing them. Not only that, but he's also actively working with the police to locate these EOs who we can sort of swap out or substitute with marginalized communities because they are socially unaccepted, they are the minority in society, and they are hidden in the interest of their own safety. So he's working with the police to track down these EOs, to learn all of their private information, figure out where he can find them, track them down, and murder them with his own hands. And he loves it. And the worst part about it, which I think ties back into the reason why I ultimately broke up with V.E. Schwab's work many, many years ago, and I do not regret that choice, is the fact that they always like to write these stories that seem profound on the surface, or these characters who are like darkly enticing, edgy, shocking, evocative, but they never once actually contend with or name the systems, the political systems and structural systems and social systems that those characters are interfacing with. And that makes their stories feel much less real. There's all these illusions, like Eli's the golden boy. He's the all-American boy. He can walk into any room and get whatever he wants. No one can resist him. He has this smile that everyone warms up to. And it's like, babe, name that for what it is. It's his white male privilege. While other EOs are flying under the radar, hiding themselves, trying to protect themselves to stay not only out of the public eye because of all the public scrutiny, but also out of the hands of the police and any other authoritative force that would probably imprison them or put them down. Eli is working hand in hand with the police. He's not afraid of the police. The police are his tools. Name that for what it is. You know, I don't like that. Obviously, I'm extremely conscious of the fact that you're supposed to be reflecting on the fact that these characters are morally bereft, how they're not great people. But, you know, the sad thing is that they're even worse than the story is willing to admit. Also, I kind of touched on it yesterday, how a lot about this story is contingent on convenience and coincidence. But another thing that just really stretched the limits of believability is the fact that Victor and Eli could have been taken in by the police so many times. They commit so many crimes, and they commit the crimes very badly and have substantial amounts of concrete evidence built up against them, whether that's witnesses or security footage or anything like that. And they just magically evade the police. Not to mention that all the female characters in this story are just props, just things for the male characters to use to their own advantage before discarding them. And, you know, that's, I guess, on brand. Here's the thing though. Obviously, I went into this project knowing that I would most likely not enjoy this reread as much as I did 10 years ago. So I don't just want to sit here and say all the things I dislike about the book, which are many, but I also want to reflect on what I think I saw in this back when I first read it in 2013. The best line in the entire book, and I think the most quoted line in the entire book, is "Plenty of humans were monstrous, and plenty of monsters knew how to play at being human." That remains a compelling concept. That remains an idea that very much holds water. So I think back then I was very drawn to how the story explores that concept. I think another part of what really appealed to me back then was the sort of role reversal that the story undertakes, which I can still admit is pretty ambitious and pretty successful. From the very beginning, Eli is positioned as the golden boy, like I said. He can do no wrong, everyone loves him, and Victor is the one who's dark, broody, petty, extremely jealous, and willing to do ostensibly horrible things just to one up Eli, and we see him do that time and time again. But after they become EOs, we see how Eli has completely spiraled down this inhumane path, past the point of no return, willing to do absolutely horrifying things, not only to get to Victor, but to gratuitously punish and execute his fellow EOs out of a misplaced sense of self-righteousness that's really self-hatred, which effectively sort of casts Victor as the hero in this case, because if he successfully tracks down Eli and exacts his revenge, he will put a stop to these killings in the process. So I think 2013 me was taken with what V.E. Schwab thinks she's doing in this story, the way she thinks that she's making the reader sort of puzzle out who's the hero, who's the villain, who's to say, when really the answer is that they both suck. So my goal isn't to undermine the story or to imply that it doesn't have merit or importance. If you enjoy the story, I'm happy for you. Me now here in 2023, it does not work for me, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have good things going for it. It has a solid thematic premise. It's fast-paced, it's highly suspenseful, especially towards the end. And, I did read it in 2 days. I have to keep coming back to that. I did read it in 2 days. So that means it has something going for it that made me want to keep turning the pages. If I had to re-rate this right now, I think it would be maybe 2 stars if I'm feeling generous. But on the plus side of things, that means we can hopefully move on to greener pastures with Daughter of Smoke and Bone. While we're here, I thought I would show you the whole set because they're actually pretty cute. Like I showed you yesterday, we have Daughter of Smoke and Bone. We have the second book, Dreams of Blood and Starlight. And of course, the third book, Dreams of Gods and Monsters. Before I go sit down and dive into this, I thought I would try to recap what I remember about the first book, and also, instead of saving it for the end, like I did with Vicious, maybe tell you now what I remember enjoying most about this series. From what I recall, this is a young adult fantasy romance trilogy, and the main character is Karou. She lives in Prague and she studies art, and she has a mysterious history. She doesn't know anything about her family, where she came from, or anything like that. And she's always kind of lived 2 lives. She spends half her time in the human world and half her time in this other magical world that no one else knows about. And eventually she reaches this point where she has to decide whether she's going to fully commit to the human world or this other magical world that could potentially hold answers about herself and her past that she's always been searching for. So what do I think 2013 me enjoyed about this trilogy? What impressions have stayed with me even over the past 9-10 years? Well, I remember being thoroughly entranced by the romance. I thought it was wondrous, whimsical, magical, deeply emotional. So hopefully that stays consistent. The other big thing, and I'm fairly confident about this because I've read Laini Taylor much more recently than I've read V.E. Schwab, for example, because I read The Strange, the Dreamer duology, is that Laini Taylor can write the hell out of a story. Her writing is lush, it's evocative, it's imaginative, and I really hope the story still delivers in that sense. And of course, there are haters. If that's not your style, I completely understand. There are people who are like, it's purple prose, it's overly flowery prose. I don't care. Inject it directly into my veins. The other thing my brain always comes back to, at least when I think about this first book, is the big twist, which obviously I know now going into it. But at the time when that twist landed, it hurt my brain. It was like a life-changing experience. The last thing I really want to say is that I'm fully aware this trilogy is like the epitome of early 2000s YA fiction. This first book came out in 2011. So there's a very real possibility that some things in the story may not have aged well, that I may feel very differently about certain things or certain characters now that I'm reading from a much different perspective and through a different lens. And I'm fully open to that. Also, I'm like a little bit too serious about bookmarks matching the aesthetic or feel or vibe of a story as best as possible. So I'm using my new Fated Mates bookmark, which is a trope that's in this book, if you didn't know and if I didn't say it. And I just wanted to share because I think that's cute and I love that for me. So I'm going to go make some lunch, get started on this bad boy, and I will update you most likely tomorrow on my progress. First of all, most importantly, I am so happy, no, relieved to be able to say that I am, in fact, enjoying this. I believe this copy is about 416 pages, and my goal yesterday was to get as close to the halfway mark as humanly possible, and I got to like 170 pages in, so I think we can call that a success. In terms of whether my remembered synopsis was accurate or not, it was pretty spot on. The story is about a young girl named Karou studying art in Prague, and she does live half in the human world and also has this secret magical life that she can't tell anyone about. The thing I didn't remember, though, is that this mystery about her past and where she comes from, who her family is, it's also a secret to her, which is to say, it's not just that she doesn't remember, it's not just that she lacks the information, she is actively being kept from discovering her past. She's been raised her entire life by this mythical chimera known as Brimstone, who basically deals in wishes. People from all over the world collect teeth on his behalf, which is exactly as morbid as it sounds, and they trade those teeth to him in exchange for wishes. So again, she doesn't really know anything about this. She doesn't know why teeth are so important or how they're being used or what the function of this magic is, but that's the family business. And also because Brimstone can't exactly walk around in the human world, she occasionally runs errands on his behalf. In terms of the vibe, the feel, the aesthetic, I feel like it's comparable to something like Pan's Labyrinth or Howl's Moving Castle. It has that sort of magic that's whimsical and imaginative, but also dark. I want to be very clear because Howl's Moving Castle is one of my favorite pieces of media in existence. So I don't want to say like it's a one-for-one match because that's a very high bar to set, but it comes to mind because Howl's Moving Castle is a portal fantasy in the same way that this story is also a portal fantasy. And even in the same way, it has that magic where it's like you open a door in one place and you end up somewhere else. It especially calls Howl's Moving Castle to mind because, like in that story, there is this one forbidden door that Karou is not allowed to ever go through or know anything about. And you just know as the audience that eventually she will have to cross that bridge. Not much to say on the romance so far because they're still essentially strangers at this point. Their paths have crossed, but they don't yet know what the other person means to them in terms of the bigger picture. But from what I remember, it's a very slow boil, it's an elaborate setup, and I hope that there's going to be a very rewarding payoff from that. I will say, though, that as I'm reading this, I'm remembering that the two love interests are basically enemies on either side of a war. So that could be potentially dicey. And I don't know how I'll feel about that 10 years later. We'll see. I remain open to all possibilities at this point. In terms of the writing, I am enjoying that so far. It is as lush and as beautiful as I remember it to be. It reads and it feels like a fairy tale. So the tone and the writing style are definitely appropriate for what the story is trying to do. I will say the beginning had a few weird vibes in the sense that the story is really fixated on Karou's ex, Kaz, who's basically like a womanizer and kind of a stalker and just a creep in general. And I'm not really sure why we needed to linger on that so much. A lot of the focus in the beginning is Karou basically regretting having dated him and also like mourning the fact that she gave him her virginity. And I'm just like, I don't know why we need this. It just gave kind of a weird vibe that I can't really explain because it's kind of like the author is trying to set up the fact that not only are these older teenagers, but they're older teenagers who definitely fuck. And I'm just not sure if that's like super relevant. The long and short of it is, I am overall enjoying my reread of this so far. And it's interesting because I remember the broad strokes. I remember the big twists and the reveals. I know what we're working up towards, but I don't remember the finer details. So a lot of this is almost still a mystery to me at this point because I know point A and point B, but I don't know how we get from point A to point B. So even though I know what's going on, I know what's going to happen, I know things that have happened in book 2 and book 3, I still find myself going, oh my God, what's going to happen next? And when we think about stories in terms of longevity and rereadability, I think that's a really great quality to have. So I'm going to head out and read as much of this as I possibly can. Again, I don't think I'll be able to finish it today. Most likely by tomorrow afternoon, I'll be done with it. But I'm still excited to continue nonetheless. Hello, it's currently Tuesday morning, and as expected, I did not finish Daughter of Smoke and Bone last night, but I did finish it this morning. And when I say this morning, I mean literally first thing in the morning. I have an entire waking up routine I usually do where I'll watch some YouTube videos, I'll go through my emails, I'll do my daily tasks or puzzles in the video games I play every single day. Not today. Just woke up, rolled over, and went straight into this. And it was quite the experience. I both wish and don't wish you could have seen the exact moment I finished rereading this book because I just burst out into laughter out of shock, I think. And I kept repeating to myself over and over and over again, oh boy, what do I do with this? Mentally, I'm in such a weird place right now because this absolutely scratched that nostalgic itch that I was hoping it would. It was this beautiful, lush, imaginative, sweeping, epic fantasy romance that I remember that it was, and it made me sort of feel that same way in a sense. But there are also central parts of this story that are morally bound in things that I do not personally endorse. And because I don't remember how those things play out over the course of the trilogy and what kind of nuance is or is not on display in regards to those central tenets of the story, I don't know how to feel. So let's just dive in. Let's break it down. I do have some critiques, so I'm going to start with those. First of all, I forgot to mention this yesterday, but in some respects, this story definitely does feel like it was written in 2011, especially with Karou. She really suffers from that not like other girls syndrome. And granted, she is literally not like other girls, but there were some aspects of that that caused me to raise my eyebrows, shall we say. The problem is kind of twofold because not only do we not know her origins or her past or where she's from, anything like that, but because of that, she becomes this almost ethnically ambiguous character, and she's also extremely worldly because she has access to this magic, this portal magic that can take her anywhere in the world. So she's constantly immersed in all these different cultures and languages, and in order to convey that worldliness to the reader, sometimes her narration contains questionable things. I did actually note some passages to explain what I mean by that, and in this one she's describing her best friend's new boyfriend, Mick, and she says, Mick was sandy-haired and fair-skinned, with sideburns and a goatee, and the kind of knife-blade eyes that hinted at ancestors invading across the plains from Central Asia. I read that and I'm like, hey, Lainey, I both do and do not know what you mean about that, and it doesn't feel great, and I don't think I like it. This other example I think is even more egregious, and for context, in this scene, Karou is describing one of Akiva's comrades who is being very imposing, intimidating, scary, and proposing violence against both Karou and Akiva. And so to describe her, she says, she had the dead eyes of a jihadist. I don't feel like we needed that. I didn't actually flag the page for it, but there was another part, and albeit this part is told from the perspective of Karou's ex-boyfriend Kaz, who, if you'll remember, is an asshole, and he sees Akiva for the first time, and even glamored to appear as human, he still seems otherworldly, ethereal, inhumanly beautiful, all of those things, and Kaz notices how beautiful he is, and there's this note that normally he wouldn't acknowledge whether another man is attractive or not because to him, that's gay. And in complete fairness, at least in that case, that is immediately challenged in the narration afterwards. It's said in the narration that that's a very silly thing for a person to think. But as with all of the examples I just shared with you, my thought remains, but did we need it in the first place? So there's that. There are those occasional 2010 isms, I'll call them, that I don't think are needed. But there's also some much hairier stuff, so let's get into that. I mentioned before, I think yesterday, that as I was reading this, I was remembering that this is not only like a fated mates, reincarnated lovers type of situation, but an enemies to lovers kind of dynamic, because both characters are situated on either side of a war between their two species. And as predicted, that is pretty dicey territory, to say the least. Again, for the sake of spoilers, I'm going to try to describe what I mean, but not say anything too specific. But basically, as I said, Karou has been raised her entire life by Chimera, so that's one species, and Akiva is a seraphim. And their species have been locked in this war for generations. And this book, at least, is very non-specific about the origins of that conflict. We don't know when it started, why it started, or what has really incited the generational hatred that exists between these two species. And I think what's so hard for me to reconcile about that is the fact that the war in this story is based in a fantasy world. It's far removed from humanity, humankind, human politics, and society and culture and all of those things. At least that's how it positions itself. So it's essentially being used for dramatic and thematic effect. But I can't help but parallel what's happening in this story to the real life atrocities that we're seeing unfold right now in terms of Israel's occupation of Palestine. A lot of things happening between the Seraphim and the Chimera definitely echo what's happening in the genocide of Palestinians as we speak. And so when I think about it in that context, could I see two people from either side of that real world conflict? And could I feel good about reading a romance between them? And for me, the answer is obviously no. And what makes it even harder to parse through, as I said, is the fact that we don't know the exact origins or nature of this war between these two species. We just know that they've been fighting for generations and generations. But as in real life, it's pretty easy to tell who's the colonizer and who's the colonized, who are the subjugators and who are the subjugated. And to me, at least in this first book, it's very clear that the Chimera are the subjugated. So if we extrapolate that and examine it through our own politics, morals, ethics, etc., as we should, then it becomes very clear that Karou is essentially romantically engaged with and invested in her oppressor. And even though the circumstances are extraordinary, and even though I think that dynamic is purposefully challenging in order to further the thematic work of the trilogy itself, it's still not great. And I could admit that. This is going to seem like a very strange comparison, and I'm actually thinking through it and articulating it in real time, so just stick with me on this. But it really reminded me of how I just recently watched All the Light We Cannot See, which is the adaptation of the book on Netflix, which I can now talk about since the SAG-AFTRA strike has formally concluded. And I feel like that story is doing something similar to what this trilogy is trying to do as well, in the sense that both of them put you in the perspective of someone who is firmly on the wrong side of history and tries to humanize them and enamor you as the audience to them by showing the depths of their humanity, the nuance of their personhood. But then by doing so, almost attempts to absolve them of their responsibility in upholding those systems of violence and oppression by making the argument that it wasn't their choice. And maybe that's a case to be made, but in my eyes, if you want to see the fullness of someone's humanity, especially in that case, you have to actually hold them to account for their actions and for their participation in upholding these systems of violence and oppression, whether that participation was willing or benign. And it can't just be erased because of your inherent goodness, your good deeds, your conscience, or because one person loves you. Can a person like that even be redeemed in the first place? I don't have the answer to that question, but I know for sure if they want to be redeemed by the definition of the word, then they have to be held accountable, and it has to be on a large scale. It can't just be because they're loved in one person's eyes. That said, I do respect the vision. I understand at least the intent. I see the thematic work that this trilogy is trying to undertake in showing that there is a future outside of violence and war that is built on love and mutual support and collectivism. But also to that end, it's possible that the story slightly leans towards being idealist. I think you can tell I have very complicated feelings about this reread, but there were actually some good things about this experience that I did enjoy. It's kind of funny that I touched on how I really enjoyed the role reversal that happened in Vicious, because there's also a kind of narrative role reversal that happens in Daughter of Smoke and Bone, in the sense that you think the story is one thing for more than half the book, and then suddenly it flips the script and it's not at all what you thought. So even 10 years later, that part of the story still worked for me. I found it to be tremendously effective, the way the story kind of pulls the rug out from under your feet and goes, oh, you thought this was like a typical run-of-the-mill YA urban fantasy story? Psych, it is a full-on epic fantasy. And even with the criticisms I have, I do still have to acknowledge that there's a huge nostalgia factor in revisiting this story for me. So that definitely made it hit differently for me than when I read, for example, Vicious. So the story is beautifully told. It has this rich, dramatic flair to it. It's innovative, it's exciting, it's enticing, it's enthralling, it's engaging, all of those things. And I do at least respect the thematic work it's trying to accomplish, even if I do question the method. And ultimately, the strongest message that's running throughout the story is that hope is the greatest form of magic. And I do think that's still a message worth getting behind all these years later. So here are the 2 books I read for this retrospective reading project. I hope you enjoyed it. They were both equally challenging in their own respective ways, although I will admit that in a general sense, I did at least enjoy the process of revisiting this. Clearly, my reading taste has changed drastically in the last 10 years, and also I read much more widely and much more diversely than these 2 titles suggest. But at the same time, this is a really good indicator of what I was reaching for back in late 2013, early 2014. So if anything, this experience, this experiment, whatever you want to call it, has reminded me why reading widely, reading with intention, reading with purpose, and reading critically actually makes me feel so much closer to the stories I read and makes me appreciate the stories I read that much more. So that brings us to the end of the vlog. I hope you enjoyed watching this process, even though it was so chaotic, and even though I had capital T thoughts on both of these books, it was fun and I did enjoy myself overall, and it was strangely nice to have these 2 blasts from the past. All of that said, it's going to be my 10th year on BookTube for the entire next year after this, until my channel turns 11, because that's how age and that's how time works. So I'm open to doing more of these early channel retrospectives if that's something you would like to see, and if so, definitely let me know in the comments. But that is everything for today. Thank you so much for watching, not just today, but every single time you click on one of my videos. Thank you so much for all the years of support and kindness, and for allowing me to do this thing I love so much for 10 years. But that is everything. Thank you so much again, and I'll see you next time.